Hello everyone, I'm Nökwi.
And I'm Peter.
And
we
are
the
Birds
of Play.
Since we first launched our channel back in June 2020, we have been engaging with the Final Fantasy online community in ways that we never had before, and it's been a great experience. From Reddit to Facebook to Twitter and even Instagram. And everywhere we go, we found people that both share our love for Final Fantasy and are willing to discuss these games with us. But one thing that surprised me is that I have, on occasion, encountered players denouncing the character of Wakka from Final Fantasy X as a racist bigot that exemplifies seemingly everything wrong with the world. I've seen some players sharing personal anecdotes about how Wakka was once their favorite character, but that now they can't seem to stand him. And that's totally fine. People are free to like who they like and to have those feelings evolve over time. Most of this is also done for laughs, poking fun at Wakka for his racist persona and seemingly blind devotion to Yavanism. Some even claim that the character hasn't aged well, not displaying the qualities expected of someone taking part in modern society. This criticism of Wakka is by no means a movement of any sort, so let's not blow things out of proportion. But it got me personally thinking about Wakka and why it's actually a good thing that Wakka is racist.
Oh, you mean Waka as a person being racist? I thought you were talking about his stereotypical Rastafarian voice and his mannerisms most people have a problem with. In that case, I'm afraid you might be poking the bear a bit too hard with this one, racism being a very flammable subject at the moment. And I think it might be very easy for the thumbnail to cause some sort of misunderstanding about our view on these issues.
Yeah, so I'm not talking about Wakka being this racist stereotype, but rather Wakka himself being a racist.
Damn the outbid! What do they want from us? Those sand-plastic grease monkeys!
And in regard to this possibly causing a misunderstanding, I'm of course hoping to elaborate on this further as we move the discussion along, but I think it's best that I make this as clear as I can right from the start. I'm not saying that being racist is good, or that we should be racist. What I am saying, however, is that racism being portrayed in Final Fantasy X through the character of Wakka is in fact not a negative thing, and shouldn't reflect badly on the game, or maybe even the character of Wakka. This is very important. Racism bad, racism being portrayed as a part of Wakka's character in the game, good.
Well, I guess we could say that racism doesn't get a good rep in Final Fantasy X, and is rightly depicted as a flaw in Wakka's character. When we first meet Wakka, he is portrayed as this upstanding member of the Church of Yevon, following the teaching to a T. His racism then mainly stems from being indoctrinated by the teachings of Yevon into viewing Al-Beds and their use of forbidden technology as a sacrilegious act that labels their entire race as something to be condemned. Wakka's whole character arc is, however, about subverting the power and authority that these racist ideas have over him and have had over him, presumably all his life. So Wakka's hero narrative is actually about overcoming his prejudice and ultimately condemning racism itself.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head there, brother. So, this narrative about overcoming prejudices is a big part of why it's actually a good thing that Wakka was racist. It makes for a compelling character arc that even has a good lesson associated with it. But then again, I've seen people argue, welcome to the world of the internet I guess, that it's in no way acceptable that someone is racist to begin with. You might have heard this line of argument being used about old people that harbor some seemingly racist views, saying that Aunt Debbie's racism, or whatever aunts are called in English-speaking countries, cannot be excused or explained by referring to the norms of the society that she grew up in.
Well, if racism is bad, then I guess the reason for it shouldn't really excuse it. At least if we consider bad things as something to be avoided and even actively fought against.
Sure, that's a view that I can be sympathetic to, but I can also be somewhat sympathetic to prejudices being something that isn't necessarily easy to overcome. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had this idea about how it's actually difficult to be a believer in a society of believers, speaking in a Christian context, but I think it's applicable to ideologies in a more general sense as well. And what it means, at least in part, is that in a society where certain things are taken for granted, it's hard to establish a genuine connection or bond with belief. Kierkegaard believing that faith had to be cultivated at the level of the individual. Another relevant example, which is actually also Danish, might be the fable of the Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen. wherein the emperor is duped into parading around town naked, believing that he's actually wearing the most exquisite robes that can only be seen by those pure of heart, or those that aren't stupid or incompetent. So the people all pretend that they can see his clothes, because otherwise it would reflect badly on them. It isn't until a little boy points out that the emperor is actually naked that the people realize that they have been fooled. And here's the important bit. We all like to imagine that we are that little boy, and that we would be the ones to see through the charade. But statistically speaking, it probably wouldn't be us. Meaning that if we are blessed enough not to be racist, then it's probably not because we stumbled onto some hard-to-acquire truth that was concealed to others, but rather that these are values that we inherited from our society. This makes Wakka's story even more important, as we watch him become a true believer in a society of believers and growing up to become the boy that isn't afraid to point out that the emperor is in fact naked.
Wakka growing up to become the boy. I like that. But does that mean we are done discussing Wakka's racism? I don't know how much of a discussion this has been though, since I've barely said a word.
I think this is the end of the line for how Wakka's character is actually enriched by his racism and the act of overcoming it, but I'm hoping that we can change trains a bit and explore how this portrayal of racism might reflect positively on the game as a whole. And even if you don't buy into our notion of Wakka's racism,
Don't associate me with your racist propaganda.
and even if you don't buy into our notion of Wakka's racism somehow elevating his character, I hope you will be willing to go with us a bit further, in a direction that doesn't require you to accept anything we or I have said about Wakka and his racism.
Take us on a train ride, choo-choo. Is this the Hype Hello train? If you haven't already, you should go watch our new video featuring Hypey the Hype Hello in getting hyped.
Get hype allowed.
In getting hype pellowed. In get hype hellowed.
Hype allowed.
In get hype pellowed.
It's get hype allowed.
Get hype pellowed?
Sure.
Okay.
This is the depiction of overcoming racism in a Japanese video game is particularly noteworthy, Train.
Is that a fun train to be on?
I guess we will have to see. So, it is sometimes said that cultural anxieties can manifest themselves in media.
Oh god, it's already boring.
No, this is fun. We're having fun now. So, speaking of these cultural anxieties in media, in the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, for example, people have pointed out similarities between how Frankenstein's monster is described in the book and how Greenlandic Inuits and Eskimos were depicted in the local news that covered Britain's North Pole expeditions, feeding on quite prevalent cultural anxieties in London at the time about this foreign and distant other. Looking at film, we can also see how zombies have been used in various ways, from depicting anxieties about race to the fear of nuclear apocalypse during the Cold War.
By this logic, we should expect a pandemic-inspired zombie film wherein you can become a zombie just by shaking hands or standing within 2 meters of a zombie. But how does this relate to racism in a Japanese game like Final Fantasy X?
Well, Japan has its own set of ethnic issues that have been both widespread and long-lasting. The most well-known of these is probably the treatment of the Ainu, an ethnic group indigenous to Japan, them being the original inhabitants of Hokkaido, whose history is comparable to that of Native Americans. A lesser-known but perhaps more modern issue is the treatment of Sainichi, people of Korean ancestry that have been faced with various hurdles on the way to fully assimilate into Japanese society, sometimes adopting Japanese names in order to pass for Japanese. And these are just examples of racial problems in Japan that largely stem from the country being so homogeneous, or at least thinking of itself as such. Persona 5 is a recent Japanese game that tackled a lot of societal problems in Japan, such as the institution of taibatsu, or corporeal punishment, the problem of hikikomori, or shut-ins, as well as the bad guys often parodying various real-world people and their crimes. As a story about rebellious teenagers, Persona 5's values seem to be firmly in line with a more youthful worldview, casting away some traditional values that seem to have fallen out of favor. I was at a game studies conference the other day where one of the presentations was about Persona 5, and they showed in a very interesting way how Persona 5 is actually mainly tackling societal problems that have already become fashionable to rebel against. And it was interesting that racism didn't make that list. And in this sense, Final Fantasy X's portrayal of racism is particularly noteworthy, since it's not an issue that Japanese media seems particularly interested in. This doesn't mean that Final Fantasy X's treatment of racism is by any means perfect, whatever that would look like, but it's both a strength and a weakness how general it is, denouncing racism as a whole while not really engaging meaningfully with any real-world instances of racism. But I still count it as a positive feature of the game, as opposed to a negative one.
So it's okay for me to still like Waka and Final Fantasy X?
Well, I think after such a long discussion, you should like them even more.
It's a good point. Make sure to click that bell. Time for the customary bird sounds. And remember, even birds can be racist. In fact, they're the most racist. They hate They hate everyone except themselves and their own. This backfired.